Yeah, this is going to be fun. I got involved in the dispute resolution field in the late 80s. And I just, I think Kim, gave you a little bit of the background of where I'm coming from. My background was as a psychologist working in education, and took my first mediation class in the late 80s. I was doing some work for the courts, working with kids in custody disputes, and took my first mediation class in the late 80s. And just to contextualize it, it's one of those experiences in your life when you realize why you're on the planet. And that for me was just one of those epiphany experiences where I'm going, I love this work. I love this approach to dealing with relationships. And I've spent the last, 30 plus years working in the field of conflict engagement. So what we're going to be sharing in the next 4 sessions are just some elements of a kind of one of the 2-day seminars I teach called Engaging Challenging Conversations. And really it's a sampling and an introduction to this field of engaging effectively in interpersonal conflict, exploring our relationship to that, and looking at some of the research and the literature out there around some of the best practices for building our capacity in that particular context. And so we might call this a bit of a sampler as we're looking at some sort of various elements of dispute resolution, conflict engagement, that kind of work. Our session tonight, we're going to really focus on basically 3 topics. We're going to focus on what is our individual relationship to conflict, interpersonal conflict, where did that come from, and how does that early learning potentially around conflict continue to influence the way we may engage conflict today. We're going to step back and define what is conflict and look at some basic definitions of what is interpersonal conflict. And as you'll read some of the materials that I provided you, which Kim sent out, you'll hear me talking about sort of 2 topics interchangeably: conflict and difficult conversations. For me, there's a concept of conflict, and we'll define what that is, but where is interpersonal conflict experienced? It's in the context of difficult or challenging conversations. So as we're looking at increasing our capacity and rethinking our effectiveness with conflict, it's also looking at how do we structure conversations such that they will support us to deal with conflict more effectively. So as I go back and forth, just so you know, and talk about conflict and difficult conversations, those are almost interchangeable in my mind as I begin to reflect on that. So let's dive in. And I wanted to start by, and again, the material I sent out to you had a bibliography attached to it. So most of the materials that I present and the references I make are in there if you want to follow up on those. There's a book that came out in 2002. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High. It's in the bibliography. If this is the topic you're interested in, I highly recommend it. I think it's one of the best books written out there in a broad context, both personally and professionally, for how we deal with conflict and how we engage in the conversational structures in which we tend to experience conflict. The book's written by 4 organizational development consultants, and one of the first things they begin to talk about is that, what makes some conversations more difficult than other conversations? I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll wake up in the morning and I'll be thinking about what I have on my plate for the day, and I'm going, I need to talk to so-and-so, and going, I don't want to talk to so-and-so. So what's that about? Okay. Or sometimes I walk away from a conversation going, woo, that did not go the way I hoped it would go. So what was that about? And other times I just have conversations and they're pleasant interactions and there's really nothing particularly significant about them. So in the book, Crucial Conversations, they start by saying, well, what is it that differentiates a difficult, challenging, crucial conversation from a typical conversation? And the first characteristic they identify is these are conversations where there's a perception of incompatible difference or threat. Now, the authors would say these are conversations where there are strongly held differences of opinion. But I think an element that goes beyond that is not just that I have a difference of opinion with you, it's that your opinion poses some level of threat to me. I know lots of people with whom I have differences of opinion, and I don't experience a level of threat around that. But I also have interactions with people who share their opinions and going, your opinion is problematic for me, okay, because it poses some threat in some way. We'll come back and talk about that. Now, we're going to come back and we're going to define that, and we're going to realize what is conflict. Conflict is the perception of some level of incompatible difference or threat. So at the heart of many of our difficult conversations is this experience of conflict. The second characteristic they identify is that the issues we're talking about are issues of significance. So we're not just talking about like, what do you want for dinner tonight? You know, what color should we paint the living room? I mean, those are sort of significant, but not all that significant. We're talking about issues of significance where people, you know, our identities are attached to that, their values are attached to that. The third characteristic of difficult or challenging conversations in their model would be, these are issues around which we have strong emotions. And I want to highlight that because when I'm teaching in this particular context, I'll often ask people, what do you want to learn as it relates to conflict and difficult conversations? And people will say, well, I'd like to learn how to have a difficult conversation where there's no emotions. And I feel like going, well, good luck with that one, because it's just not going to happen. And in fact, difficult conversations and conflict has a strong emotional component to it. And we're going to take a deeper dive into that next week. But just recognizing that, you know, our conflict is not necessarily about what we think about certain things. It's also about how we feel about certain things. So difficult, challenging conversations have conflict associated with issues of significance, strong emotions. These conversations in the book, Crucial Conversations, they would say these are conversations that are pivotal to our relationship. In other words, our ability to achieve some objective or to move towards some shared objective is, you know, on the other side of these conversations. You know, Kathleen, my wife, who's not in this presentation, but I can share this. We've been married 43 years, and there are times in their marriage where there's certain things we needed to talk about, so we're not talking about those things right now. And as a result of not talking about those, we would be stuck at certain points until we finally said, we got to sit down and talk about this issue. And so we would address it. Okay. So, and by talking it through, we moved through that issue, broke through that issue towards being successful about whatever we were trying to achieve. And finally, difficult conversations are often characterized by what psychologists call this approach avoidance response. You know, these are conversations I know I need to have. I don't want to have the conversation. I know I need to have the conversation. So when we're dealing with conflict and we're thinking about conflict, we can think about it, you know, as an abstract or of an intellectual construct, and we'll talk about that, we'll define it. But I think we also have to look at, you know, conflict is experienced interpersonally in the context of the conversation. And so we'll be looking at the interplay between those two things as we go through, you know, the next sessions together. So we're going to start. The first activity we're going to look at is, where did we learn about conflict? You know, at some point in our life, we experienced this thing that we would define as conflict, okay? And for many of us, that was early in our lives. And as a result of that experience, we developed strategies, you know, methodologies for navigating this particular experience, okay? And so when we engage the experience of conflict, we bring a whole lot of experience and history and narratives around that experience. Where did that come from? So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to explore where we learned about conflict. And the activity is, I want you to begin reflecting on, I want you to identify one or two events in your life that you believed really were the context that began to shape the way in which you currently relate to conflict. Now, whenever I do this activity, I realize it's a bit risky because I'm asking some of you to go to a place that is not necessarily a pleasant place, for which there may be all kinds of potentially trauma attached to that, and I recognize that. And yet, if we're going to increase our effectiveness engaging with conflicts, it's not just about, you know, developing a set of strategies and tools. It's really beginning to identify what is our way of being in this context of conflict, and where did that come from, and how does that inform the actions that we take. So as you identify these 1 to 2 events, and I'll share my particular example, why do you think those events were significant? What was significant about those events? What did you learn about conflict? And maybe what did you learn about yourself at that point? And here's, in some ways, the most important piece for where we are today is, how do those experiences inform how you show up in conflict today? Okay. So in a bit, Kim's going to, after I share an example of this, Kim's going to put you into breakout rooms. And in your breakout sessions, you're going to, one, introduce yourselves to each other, so to make sure you all know each other. And then you're going to just take 2 or 3 minutes and share your reflections on this particular question. Now, as far as basic protocol here, my expectation would be that whatever is shared in those rooms stays in those rooms. And I'm not going to ask anybody to come back out and share anything specific to your narrative. There's no expectation of that. I want you to honor people's ability to be vulnerable and take risk in that conversation and create a safe space for that to occur. So my example, as I reflected on this, maybe similar to yours, may not be, but I really did not experience conflict early in my life. I'm born and raised in Seattle, upper middle class family, middle of 5 kids, and I would say from birth to about 6th grade, I never really experienced significant conflict. Other than the traditional stuff between siblings. My best friend and I would punch each other every once in a while, and then we'd get past it and move on. So I got along with pretty much everybody. I got along with my teachers. I loved school. I mean, I have to admit, I lived a pretty idyllic childhood growing up. Now, I first experienced conflict, however, when I got to junior high. And when I got to junior high, I followed a brother who was 5 years older than me. And my brother was not just an athlete, but he was an extraordinary athlete. He was a phenomenal football player. He's one of those junior high guys who develops early. He looks like he's in college when he's in junior high. He's big, he's strong. So he's an amazing athlete, he's an amazing football player. So I followed him. And when I got to junior high, I was met by many of the coaches who had worked with him. And their response was, "Ooh, you're Tim Abell's brother." Now, in making that statement to me, they communicated this expectation that you're going to be your brother. Now, I was an athlete, but I was nowhere near the athlete that my brother was, okay? And I was really not interested in playing football. Track and field was my sport. And so I, without thinking about it, as a 7th grade boy, said, "No, I'm not turning out for football." Big mistake. And some of you may relate to this, but coaches have a way of communicating to you their dissatisfaction when you don't meet their expectations. And some of you may experience this, and some of you may find this somewhat disturbing. But to my coaches, I was, no offense here, a candy-ass panty waist. Now, if you're a 7th grade boy, you do not want to be a candy-ass panty waist. It's just really not good for your social standing, in the school community. Now, in that moment, I experienced conflict really for the first time in a significant way between myself and the coaches. And I realized that I had a choice. My choice was, one, to say, well, I don't care and I'm not going to do it. I could sort of rebel against that expectation, which was my sister's approach. Or I could accommodate that and say, okay, I guess I need to turn out. I need to meet this expectation, which is what I chose to do. I turned out for football, didn't particularly like it. But the lesson I learned, here's the lesson I learned. The lesson I learned is that people have expectations of you. When you violate those expectations, it creates conflict. So if you want to avoid conflict, here's the strategy. You assess people's expectations of you, and you work to meet or exceed their expectations, and everything will be fine. That was my strategy. Now, I will say I carried that strategy well into my 50s, until I realized at some point there was an upside to that strategy, clearly, but there was a clear downside to that strategy. Okay. And I'm seeing some of you nodding your heads. Okay. So that's what I'm looking for. But the point is that early lesson in conflict really shaped much of my response to conflict early in life as I navigated school, college and graduate school, and in many ways the early parts of my marriage. That was the approach. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is, Kim, if you would put people into your breakout sessions. I guess we have about 4 people, 4 or 5 people in a session?
Yep, we have 4 to 5 people per each group.
Okay, so take about 3 minutes and we'll call you back in about 12 to 15 minutes. Take about 3 minutes just to introduce yourselves and just share your reflections on this particular topic, and I'll see you in a little bit. Thank you.
Everybody will be back in about 30 seconds, Greg.
Thanks. I just realized I can't bring people back, so.
We'll see if they want to come back now.
Yeah, sure. They're all ticked off. All right, I'm going to assume that everyone's back now, and we're going to move on here. But let me just, I can see some of you in this screen now. How many of you could identify, just raise your hand, identify if you could identify a context in which you first experienced conflict? How many of you could identify lessons or strategies that evolved out of that context? And here's the most important, for how many of you would say those strategies remain as maybe a significant part of your repertoire of strategies today? Yeah. Now, that's not good or bad. You know, we develop a strategy, we keep using those strategies to the extent they continue to work. The question becomes, when those strategies no longer work, it doesn't necessarily make them bad strategies. We need to expand our strategies. So that's the point we want to focus on here. So I'm going to move us on fairly quickly here because I've got a lot I want to cover. So I want to just share a definition of conflict. This is a definition that I was introduced to probably early in my career. It's based on the work of a guy named Morton Deutsch, who did a tremendous amount of work around collaboration and cooperation and conflict engagement back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And the authors came up with what they call the ingredients of a conflict. You could call this almost a recipe for conflict. So the first ingredient is you got to have two or more people. So we're talking about interpersonal as opposed to intrapersonal conflict. So I have my own internal conflicts. You may have those. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about interpersonal conflict. Two or more people. Second ingredient is they got to interact with each other. You know, the interaction can be verbal or nonverbal. I spent 8 years working at-risk junior high kids. Why did you hit him? Because he looked at me. I mean, it's that sort of interaction, okay? But there's an interaction, and here's where we want to focus our attention. In the context of that interaction, there's a perception and or interpretation of some level of incompatible difference or threat. So you share your perspective with me, I share my perspective with you, and in that context, you and or I perceive and or interpret that there's evidence here of an incompatible difference or threat, okay? So you could say, where does conflict start? Conflict does not start out here someplace. Conflict starts between your ears. Now, conflict is a result of what you make something mean. And in this case, what you're making the interaction mean. We'll come back and talk about that. They go on to say that the conflict can be perceived, or the threat can be perceived as a threat to our resources, a threat to our needs, and or a threat to our values. And the thing I want to focus on here is most conflict is not about what you think it's about. You know, there's often a presenting issue, but that presenting issue is often evidence of, you know, deeper issues. One model of conflict is called representative conflict, whereas the presenting issues are representative of a deeper issue. You know, if I'm doing a workplace dispute, you know, the violation of a contract may be the presenting issue. Breakdown in trust and communication is the deeper issue that we need to get to, okay? So right now, where conflict then begins to manifest itself externally is in how we choose to behave. And go on to say that the conflict will either escalate or de-escalate based on the choices of our behavior, okay? So looking at a couple of elements of this, the first piece is this perception of incompatible difference or threat. And we, in our particular culture, as a Western US culture, have a pretty predictable paradigm that drives our behavior in that situation. Now, I understand this is a generalization, but it is, I think, pretty representative of how we are as a culture. So I'm interacting with you and you share your perspective, and I realize that your perspective is different than mine. And then my brain sort of just drops into this very predictable paradigm. Oh, you have a difference of opinion than I do. Well, it's obvious that we can't both be right. And I happen to know that I'm right. Therefore, you must be wrong. Now, once I drop into that paradigm, it drives my strategy for how to deal with the conflict. Because one, you're wrong, so I really don't care what you have to say because I've already written you off as having nothing appropriate to share. The job for me is to, one author calls it, to fix you, or Scott Peck says, to convert you to seeing things my way. Now, to the extent that that's a significant part of our Western culture, you may recognize Deborah Tannen teaches linguistics at Georgetown University. She's written a number of books on gender communication, but she wrote a book in the mid-90s called The Argument Culture. And it was really a reflection on our US Western culture. And the basic premise of the book is that we've become an extreme argument culture. We take complex issues, we take extreme positions, and we defend those positions. And what do we know about a good defense? A good defense is a good offense. And so, I look at when she wrote that book in 95 to where we are now, we've seen an exponential increase in that dynamic in our culture. The ability to hold ambiguity, the ability to hold paradox, to hold uncertainty is actually evidence of cognitive development by some theorists, but said we've lost that particular capacity. So recognizing that propensity, and we'll come back and talk about it, to drop into that paradigm, someone's right and someone's wrong. I mean, we're a highly litigious society. We spend a tremendous amount of money pursuing that particular paradigm, okay? Again, the second piece is, and we'll come back and talk about this, is that most conflict isn't about what we think it's about, okay? So I want you to recognize then that where does conflict start? Conflict starts as a result of what we would call a meaning-making process. And we'll come back and explore that in a little more detail next week. But conflict starts as a result of what I and or you make something mean. And what we're making it mean is that we pose some level of threat to each other. And in that context, choose to behave, okay? So I want us to begin, thinking about and being aware of that activity occurring as we engage conflict. Now, as we continue to look at our sort of personal relationship with conflict and our personal way of dealing with conflict, I want to come back to that. There's a model that's been out for years. It's called the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument. It's a conflict styles inventory. It's been around for years. Used to be a little simple paper and pencil assessment you could take, and it would assess your conflict style, okay? It's now become a $40 online computer-generated assessment, so I don't have the capacity to give you the assessment right now, but we're going to look at the model. And as I look at the model, I want you to begin thinking about sort of what is your sort of default conflict style, okay? Now, a couple things to know is, first of all, as I go through these 5 styles, there's not a right style or wrong style, good style or bad style. There's an upside and a downside to every one of these styles. Okay, that's the first piece. The second piece is that your style in dealing with conflict is in many ways situationally driven. So how I deal with conflict in a professional context may be different than how I deal with conflict in my personal relationships, which may be different than how I deal with conflict with my best friends. And so, the context will drive that, okay? And I think in many cases, we tend to develop, at least I think, a default sort of a style where we tend to engage conflict. Now, the styles are sorted across 2 dimensions. The first vertical dimension is how assertive is that style? To what extent does that style support you in advocating and asserting your particular needs or objectives? And the horizontal axis is cooperative. To what extent or how cooperative is that style? How does that style support your ability to work in relationship with others? So if we look at the first, so upper left-hand quadrant, the first style is competing, highly competitive, highly assertive, not particularly cooperative. When I'm approaching conflict from a competitive style, my goal is to meet my objectives. And it's not necessarily that I don't care about your objectives, but your objectives are secondary to my objectives. I need to get what I need out of this conversation, okay? Now you could say, well, that's kind of a bully way to be, and in an extreme sense, it might be. However, and if we had more time to talk about this, I'll just share, when might that be very effective? Well, for example, if you're ultimately responsible for the outcome, you're going to probably be competitive. If I'm going to be held accountable for something here, then I'm going to say, I'm going to pursue what I think is the best action here. As a parent, when my kids were little, this is not negotiable. This is because dad said so, okay? And I'm not necessarily, how you feel about that is less important to me than me making sure you're safe. So competitive as an upside and a downside in situations around safety, those kinds of things. If we go to the opposite lower hand corner, accommodating is the opposite of competing. When I'm accommodating, I'm very cooperative. I'm really focused on the relationship. I'm really focused on maintaining the relationship to the extent that I will, in many ways, acquiesce on things that are important to me so as to maintain the relationship, to be perceived as cooperative and, you know, easy to get along with, okay? Now you could say, well, that's kind of a wimpy way to be. However, oops, I'm sorry, did I just change something here? Am I still screen sharing?
Now you are screen sharing, yes.
Okay.
Greg, you weren't before, and I realized that I think you were meaning to be, so now I'm screen sharing.
Oh,
Would you like to screen share instead?
I will just real quickly fix that. Go ahead,
Okay.
if it works for you, that's fine. Oh wait, now where are we? Kim, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. I think it might be, is it easier for you to screen share? I'll stop and you can start again.
Okay, I apologize, folks. Let me, yeah, if you don't mind, commit me host again.
Yeah,
Okay,
you should
just
be all set up.
1 second, folks, here while I readjust this. Oh, I lost my ability to screen share. Let me. Well, okay.
Greg, oh, there we go.
Are we seeing that? Do you see that grid? So Kim, are you controlling the slides right now?
No, I think that's you, Greg. And we see
Oh, got it.
a
There we go.
side by side.
There we go. Okay. Can you see the matrix now?
We see two screens.
Well, let's just work
Yeah,
right
we
now.
see
Can
a
you see
split.
can you see the grid?
Yes. we
Let's
can
just
see the
focus on
grid.
that for right now. So accommodating, highly cooperative, not assertive. When would you choose to accommodate? You'll often choose to accommodate when the issue is not that important to you. So yeah, I have an opinion, but like in the grand scheme of things, I really don't care. Okay.
Excuse me, Greg, excuse me, can you enlarge it? It was larger before. It's really tiny on my screen, on my iPad. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
That is better. Thank you.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. We're good to go. Thanks,
Okay.
Greg.
So accommodating, highly cooperative, not assertive. Often choose to accommodate when it's not important to you. You choose to accommodate when you're committed to sort of building social capital, you're building relationships, you know, with the idea that down the road there may be reciprocity. Lower left-hand quadrant is avoiding. When you're avoiding conflict, you're neither assertive nor cooperative. You're not engaging the conflict, nor are you allowing the other to engage the conflict. You're just not going there, okay? Now we could say, you know, you can't avoid conflict because at certain times, you know, you're going to need to address it. But there are times when you are going to avoid conflict. It's not the right time. You haven't got the right people. You haven't got sufficient time. It's not the right context. So there's an upside to that. Compromising in the middle is where we tend to fall as a culture. You're saying you just need to learn to compromise. And, you know, compromise says you're somewhat assertive, somewhat cooperative, but you're going to have to find some middle ground. There's going to be some level of give and take. So it's expedient. It works in a situation where you're going to have to prioritize things. But the downside of compromise is that it may leave certain issues unresolved that you're going to need to come back to. The upper right-hand quadrant, collaboration, then would be highly assertive, highly cooperative. You know, the term we often say when we're collaborating that we're balancing advocacy with inquiry. I'm going to strongly advocate what's important to me, but I'm going to also strongly inquire as to what's important to you, okay? Now you could say, well, that's obviously the right way to approach it. You know, the downside to collaboration, it takes time, takes commitment, takes skills, and we don't always have the time to, quote, collaborate on everything. So the point is it's in our context today is begin looking at, where do I tend to find my comfort zone there? Where do I tend to go? You know, if you go back to my early learning about conflict, what did I learn? What was the strategy I learned early on about conflict? Accommodation. You assess what people need and you meet those needs, okay? Now that worked well for me because as a fairly laid back kid, it motivated me to do things that I might not necessarily have done, okay? You know, I took on objectives that were sort of expected of me that, you know, I was kind of like, whatever, which has served me well. But the downside was that at some point you burn yourself out when you're trying to sort of meet everyone else's expectations, okay? So any questions, and just feel free to unmute at this point. Are there any questions regarding the conflict styles differentiation?
Greg, there's another dimension to this, which would be power, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, and Matt, that's a whole piece that we're not going to probably even address right now today. But yeah, absolutely. Power. And that, I mean, that's a whole nother way of exploring who has power, what does power look like, how does power change over time? So absolutely, absolutely. Anybody
Hey,
else?
Greg, can you elaborate on the difference between compromising and accommodating?
Accommodating says, I'm willing to walk away having not had my needs met, my objectives met. And my main objective is that you are satisfied with the outcome of this conversation. And I'm satisfied that you're satisfied, even though it didn't work for me, because that was my objective. Okay. Or I accommodated because, you know, I could have gone to the mat on this and I could have argued with you about what color to paint the front door. But in the grand scheme of things, you wanted to paint it. That's great. Go for it. You know what I mean? So that's that kind of a accommodation. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask Kim to put us back in our groups for just about 10 or 15, 10, 12 minutes. So come back at, looking at where my clock, my timer is. Let's come back at about 7:05, okay, if you would please, all right? But in your groups, I'd like you to reflect on these questions, okay? What do you believe to be your preferred or dominant conflict style? And again, recognizing that there are the context is going to drive that. I had a colleague a number of years ago who's every time she took this instrument, she said, you know, I really tend to come out really collaborative and really compromising. And she said, then I thought I would take it with my teenage daughter in mind. And when I took it in that context, I came out extremely competitive. And I just started laughing because I'm going, well, duh, because both she and her daughter are extremely competitive. And in that relationship, that's what manifested, okay? If you have a dominant style, are there certain situations that pull you away from that into a different style? And then the second question I want you just to reflect on is, when you are confronting or experiencing conflict, what are you looking for in the context that would say, yeah, I don't want to go there, but I'm going to engage this situation. As much as I may want to avoid this, there's evidence in this context that says I can dive in, I can have this conversation. What are you looking for that has you make that choice? Or what are you experiencing? The second, what do you experience that has you saying, as much as I think there's a value in having that conversation, I'm not going there? What would have you make that decision? Okay. So Kim, if you would put us back in our groups and bring us back in about 10 or 12 minutes, about 7:05 or so, reflect on those questions with your friends.
Is there a way we can have this slide in the breakout room? Because I can't remember the questions. I don't know if that's possible.
I will try to put it in the chat room.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anna, you might not be able to access it on chat once you're in your breakout room though. So it is in your email if that helps.
Yeah. All right, welcome back, everybody. So where we are in this point is just really beginning to establish, you could call a baseline of my understanding of relationship to conflict. So where did I learn about conflict? What is conflict? Do I tend to demonstrate a conflict style in various situations? What are the ramifications of that? And again, there are so many other dimensions to conflict that we could be exploring at this point, but just again, beginning to get a picture of that. And also beginning to get a sense of, okay, when do I choose to engage conflict? When do I choose to avoid conflict? What are the factors that I'm observing in a situation that leads me to make one decision versus another decision, okay? So we're gonna move on. First of all, are there any questions or feedback before we move on and really finish for sort of the last 20 minutes here?
Not so far.
Okay. Thank you. Just a thumbs up. Am I screen sharing still? Just make sure I'm, okay, great. Okay, thank you. So as I said in the introduction, that we would be talking sort of both at looking at conflict as a construct, but also looking at the context in which we experience that. And that's in the context of the conversation, okay? And really, if I look at what I do professionally, my job is to step into someone else's conversation and restructure that conversation. As a mediator, I step into a conversation where people are stuck, they've reached impasse, and my job is to restructure the conversation that will lead to a different outcome. Okay, as a facilitator, the same idea here. So I just want to begin, giving you some paradigms for thinking about what do we mean by conversational structure. Because ultimately, if we want to change our relationship to conflict, we want to begin looking at where can I influence the structure of the conversation that will change that relationship and will change the potential outcome, which is what we're going to be focusing on again in our subsequent time together. So with that in mind, just going to share two different paradigms for you to think as you think about this idea of conversational structure. The first one comes from a book called Difficult Conversations. Difficult Conversations by Stone, Patton, and Heen comes out of the Harvard Negotiations Project. It's part of that whole series of work that came out of that project. And in the book Difficult Conversations, they say that when you're engaging a difficult conversation, you're typically going to engage from one of two types of stances, is the term that they use. Another term for stance would be a way of being in the conversation. So the first stance they would say is a telling stance. And when I'm coming from a telling stance, I'm really coming from that fundamental paradigm that says one of us is right and one of us is wrong. And that's the context that's driving this conversation. So when I come from that telling stance, or when I come into it with that telling stance, I bring certain characteristics or attributes. The first is judgment. I've assessed what you think, your point of view, and I've judged it. It's wrong, it's incomplete, it's not very well thought out, it's not a fully baked idea. The second characteristic is hubris, which is, I had to look that word up because I don't use it that often, but hubris is arrogance. And when I'm coming from a telling stance, I often come from a sense of arrogance. I know more than you do. I have more experience than you do. I've lived on the planet longer than you have. If you had this degree, this, those kinds of things. I come across with a sense that, my perspective has much more value than your perspective. And there's an arrogance in that. A certain amount of pretense, a certain amount of posturing, assumptions that are going on. And the distinction I want to make here, I'm not saying you shouldn't tell people what you think. That's not what this is about. A telling stance isn't what you're doing, it's how you're being. And how you're being is dismissive of what the other person brings to the conversation, because I've judged it as if not having value. So the shift we want to make is to shift from a telling stance to entering the conversation from a learning stance, okay? And this is, for me, is fundamental. Is seeing this conversation as an opportunity for learning something new, okay? So in the book Crucial Conversations, they introduce, I really think, a nice little metaphor for this. What they say is that whenever you enter a difficult or crucial conversation, you bring to the conversation what they refer to as your personal pool of meaning. And my personal pool of meaning is everything that's informing me about the conversation. So my experience, my education, my gender, my spiritual orientation, my family background, my culture, That's my pool of understanding or pool of meaning. And by the same token, you come from your personal pool of meaning or understanding. And their assertion is that in every conversation, you and I are always operating from different pools of understanding, not sometimes, always. So in a telling stance, the conversation basically said, well, there's your pool and my pool. The purpose of this conversation is to determine which one's right, which one is going to inform our action. A learning stance says, no. The point of the conversation is to take our individual pools of understanding and share them so as to create a deeper shared pool of understanding. That's the metaphor. So we're taking this conversation and say, let's take what we know individually and let's share it so that we now know it collectively. Now, in that deeper shared pool of understanding, it does not mean that somehow magically we are in agreement on everything. Because in that deeper shared pool of understanding will typically be three sort of dimensions. One, there'll be things about which you and I clearly agree. So I can say, yeah, no problem, agree with you on that. Based on the conversation, there will probably be things about which we are now uncertain. I often find myself going, I got to think about that some more. Maybe not as clear as I thought I was on that. And thirdly, we will find things about which you and I may fundamentally never agree. Now, does that mean we can't move forward? No. It just means we now have a richer understanding. Okay. And many would that would say is that conflict is a context for new learning. Conflict pushes us outside our comfort zone and pushes us into new learning. And from that new learning is where innovation and creativity come from. So in shifting our relationship to conflict, for many that I work with, people have a negative relationship to conflict. It's a diversive experience. And what we'll find is that over time, it's not about resolving the conflict, it's learning to be with that conflict and seeing it as that opportunity. So when we engage conflict from a learning stance, we bring a sense of curiosity. Yeah, hadn't thought about it that way. Tell me more about that. It's a humble stance, which says, I may know a whole lot about whatever we're talking about. I may have done my graduate work on that topic. However, what don't I know? I don't know what you know. And if I knew what you knew, I would know more. And I value that idea of knowing more. I'm committed to that. A learning stance is about presence. Truly being present. We could talk, there's books written on that about not just being present into the conversation to look at the flaws of your reasoning, but being present to say, what am I learning in this conversation? And a learning stance basically says, let's approach the conversation acknowledging what we say we believe, that there's value in diversity of opinion. My experience is I work with a lot of groups who say we value diversity of opinion, but that's only true until it shows up. When the diversity shows up, we tend to often crucify each other. And so how do we step back? So one way of thinking about the conversational structures, am I coming into this conversation, structuring it from a telling perspective? I'm here to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. Or am I structuring the conversation from a learning perspective that says, let's look at this in a way of divergent thinking and expanding our understanding. So that's one model of thinking about it. The second model I want to introduce comes from a book called Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together by William Isaacs. It's an excellent book. And Isaacs takes a conversation and he actually creates a flow chart. He sort of creates a flow chart to track an unfolding conversation. And he identifies in the unfolding conversation what he refers to as choice points. And he says that in any conversation, we enter a choice point where, depending on what we choose at that point in the conversation, it will influence the subsequent structure of the conversation, okay? So he starts with the conversation, you're talking, I'm talking, you're talking, I'm talking. And we're not just having a conversation, we're having a conversation around a high stakes issue, strong emotions, strongly held differences of opinion. So Isaac would say that in the context of the conversation, you and I engage in what he calls deliberation. To deliberate means to weigh out. So as we're having the conversation, I'm thinking about what you're saying, I'm thinking about your perspective, I'm weighing it out as it relates to my thinking and my perspective. And in the context of deliberation, Isaac says, we enter the first choice point. Now, I would circle this choice point, I would highlight it, because one of our things we need to focus on if we're going to get more effective in dealing with conflict is becoming cognizant of what we do at this choice point, okay? Now, Isaacs makes it pretty simple. He says, we're going to make one of two choices at this point in the conversation. One, we're going to choose to suspend judgment. Now, suspending judgment doesn't mean I don't make a judgment. Suspending judgment says, I'm starting to make a judgment. I'm starting to make a judgment that you don't know what you're talking about, that you haven't thought this through very clearly, that you're kind of clueless. I make that judgment. But then to suspend judgment says, nope, I'm going to actually disidentify with that judgment. I'm going to say, nope, not going to go there. I haven't, I'm jumping to conclusions. I'm making some assumptions. I need to not go there. So suspending judgment requires the internal awareness that I am making that judgment. It's not about not making the judgment. It's recognizing I am making the judgment and making a choice as to what to do in that context. The second choice, he would say, is to defend that and to say, not only do I disagree with you, I think, you're a problem and you're a threat to me and I need to defend myself from you, okay? Now, given what I've shared earlier, our cultural response in most conflict is to go to defend. I mean, that's where we tend to go, okay? Now, Isaacs would say that if we choose either by default or intent to go to defend, we enter a second choice point. And he says we're going to have one of two types of conversations. We're going to have what he calls a controlled discussion or what he calls a skillful conversation. So what's the difference? The word discussion comes from the root word discutere, I believe, which means to strike apart. It's the same root word as percussion. But a controlled discussion is basically a debate. Now, I understand debate's a complex notion and lots of different models of debate. But what's the basic outcome of a debate? There's a winner and a loser, okay? Now, in an academic debate or in a legal context, there's rules or structures to the debate. But in interpersonal context, more often than not, we have what I refer to as a street brawl debate, which means one of us is going to win this argument. Now, because we're civilized people, we'll typically start by attacking each other's ideas. But if that doesn't work, and if the issue's significant enough, we tend to attack each other. And for many people who avoid conflict, it's because of that context. I've had people tell me, I'm never raising my hand in a meeting again. I go, why, what happened? I raised my hand and I shared my idea and I got crucified. So I'm not going there, okay? So for many, our experience with conflict is that kind of conversation. We can have a skillful conversation, and he uses the term dialectic, which is a philosophical structure of conversation. To simplify it, I think it's just a darn good argument. I have two very good friends that work with me in this field. One of my friends is, Ren, you'll appreciate this, is a retired pastor. My other friend is a retired lawyer. He was a litigator for 35 years. And two things that my friends share in common is one, they both love to argue. And two, they have strong political orientations, okay? My pastor friend is very far left. My lawyer friend is very far right. And we were hanging out once, and my lawyer friend, who likes to do every once in a while, began picking on my pastor's politics. And they ended up traveling down this very heated argument. And, and I was sort of the observer, and the argument sort of escalated, and it got fairly heated, and then it sort of de-escalated and ran out of steam. And at the end of the conversation, I just looked at both of them and said, did either of you learn anything in that conversation? And my lawyer friend looks at me and goes, no, that wasn't the point. His sense was, I like to argue because it strengthens my thinking. Now, I'm not here to argue about that being good or bad. However, both of those structures do not focus on divergent expanded learning. They tend to focus on defending a point of view and arguing that in a number of different ways. So suspending judgment, what we need to really realize when we're engaged in conflict is there's two things I often tell people if you want to get better at dealing with conflict. Number one, increase your capacity for curiosity. Recognize that most conflict's not about what you think it's about. So if it's not, you need to get curious. Secondly, develop a high level of self-awareness, through reflection and mindfulness of what do I do at that choice point? When at that choice point of defend or suspend, where do I tend to go? And choose to suspend. If we suspend, it invites us then into a conversation of dialogue. Dialogue as a conversational structure, its primary purpose is to create a deeper shared pool of understanding. It's not about argument or debate. It's about shared learning. It's about deepening that pool. And, in some cases, that's all we're looking at, just reflective dialogue, just expanded learning. However, in some contexts, that dialogue needs to generate action, which means that's where innovation and creativity comes from. So again, recognizing as we begin thinking about conversational structure, and this is one of my passions, I love to watch conversations, so I can just sort of watch people make these choices and watch it unfold and then decide where do you need to intervene. As we're moving forward and as we're going to wrap things up here, I want to just share a couple of final thoughts, but one of the things I'd like you to focus on the next week is, one, become aware of your meaning-making process. What are you making things mean? When you find yourself in conflict, step back and say, what am I making what that person's saying mean? Now, the follow-up question to that is always, what else could it mean? Okay, what are you making it mean, but what else could it mean? So become cognizant of that meaning-making process going on. Secondly, become aware of and maybe begin observing conversational structures. Where do you see people engaging in telling conversations? Where do you see yourself doing that? Where do you see yourself engaging in a learning conversation? Where do you find yourself engaging a situation where I got a choice here? I can defend myself, or I can step back and suspend judgment and explore this more fully. So I like to say, I want you in the next week to practice noticing. Okay, just practice noticing in yourself your relationship in these particular situations. So when we're taking a learning stance, we're really shifting our orientation to the conversation. When we're moving to suspend, it's a shift from certainty to curiosity. Certainty says, I know everything I need to know, thank you very much, and nothing you have to share is going to add value. Curiosity is committed to learning. It's a shift from debate to exploration. Convergent thinking versus what we call divergent thinking. It's a shift from simplicity to complexity. In other words, realizing there's multiple perspectives here. This is not about who's right or who's wrong. This is not about a right answer and a wrong answer. This is about a more complex issue that has multiple dimensions to it. And it's about either or, not either or thinking, but about both and thinking. So I'll just end with a couple quotes here that are two of my favorite quotes. Individually intelligent people can collectively make stupid decisions from shallow pools of understanding. And we can laugh at that, and yet it's actually tragic in a lot of ways, okay? In the book Crucial Conversations, the authors, who are organizational development consultants, tell a story where they were working with a healthcare organization. And while they were working for that healthcare organization, a situation arose in one of the hospitals where a woman was wheeled into the hospital for a routine appendectomy. At the end of the surgery, half of her foot had been removed. And the CEO of the hospital goes, could you guys help us investigate how this could have happened? And upon investigation, what they realized that there were no less than 7 people who were aware something was going wrong, but chose not to say anything because they didn't want to confront. They didn't want to engage the conflict. Certain people don't challenge certain people. If you're a technician, you don't challenge a doctor. If you're a nurse, you don't challenge a doctor. You don't question that. You don't want to enter into that conflict. So it's funny at one level, but it's also true. We don't engage. We don't have the conversation. One measure of a group's intelligence is the depth of its shared pool of understanding. And how do we deepen our shared pools of understanding? We open up conversations of shared learning. We engage conflict. We create context where we can explore diversity of opinion in a safe way that expands our shared knowing. And out of that is where innovation and creativity occurs. So I will stop there and just see if there's any questions. I think we're right about at 8:30. If there's any questions that you want to add at this point.
I was confused about dialectic.
So if I understand dialectic, it's a philosophical process of orientation, and there may be other people on who can speak more specific to that, where you're really ferreting out the differences between two opposing truths, okay? And so if you look it up in the dictionary, they'll say it's a philosophical structured method of argumentation and exploration. Because the term's complex, I tend to just say, it's kind of a darn good argument where you're defending and articulating your point of view and exploring the differences with another person's point of view. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? I hope that's helpful.
Okay. I have another question, which is, I really like the charts and how this particular one about how choice points and stuff, but it's hard for me to imagine that if there's a fair amount of emotion going on, that people are going to be able to be step back enough to observe, to see what's going on, to figure that out.
Yeah, and that's why I think that, as I've taught this for the last 25 years, developing self-awareness, becoming cognizant of those choice points is a practice. And I think one of the primary ways of practicing and developing that capacity is developing a practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness is the practice of self-awareness absent self-judgment. Ooh, I'm beginning to judge this person. I'm beginning to defend myself. Ooh, not going to go there. But you can't do that in the moment in the context of that high emotion if you haven't practiced that. So when I'm helping people develop skills, I'm going, that's a skill that requires practice. And I think mindfulness, if I want to identify something that many people are aware of, is one of the best ways to increase that capacity.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Well, I hope you found this helpful. We've just kind of dabbled in a little bit of the edges here. Next week, we're going to focus on the issue of, if conflict isn't about what we think it's about, how do I figure out what it's about? So I'm going to introduce you to 3 paradigms that many mediators and facilitators use to analyze the conflict that will then inform the action we take as we intervene, as we take on that conflict. So I'm going to ask you next week to actually come with an identified conflict, an interpersonal conflict that maybe you're experiencing. Because what we're going to be doing is I'm going to introduce you to a paradigm, and I'm going to say, okay, apply that paradigm to your situation. If you apply that to your situation, what insight does it give you? How does it inform you? And then we'll reflect on that in small groups. Then I'll introduce you to another one and another one. And each time you'll get a chance to reflect on your situation and saying, if I look at my situation through that lens, does it inform me in ways that will then lead to more effective action moving forward? So thank you very much for being here. I'm going to turn it back to Kim just to see if there's anything we need to do to wrap up here. If not,
Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you didn't get the copies of the slides that Greg used tonight, just shoot me an email, and my email is in the chat, I believe, or you can, actually, I'll put it in the chat right now as soon as I'm done speaking. So if you don't have my email, you can wait for just a moment and I'll put it in the chat. All the copies of the slides are there. And if you have to miss a session for any reason, those again will be on our Grace YouTube page. So you'll be able to watch a session that you need to miss. And I'll send that out. I'll send that address out to participants so you can access those. And Greg, I know that I'm speaking for all of us when I just say thank you so much for this. This is fascinating and just gives us plenty to take into the week with us. So thank you so much for your time and your sharing your expertise and your wisdom with us.
Thank you very much. See you guys next week.
All right, go in peace, friends.
That's good.